The reading this morning is from Joshua, and it's the whole of chapter 2. Rahab and the spies. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. The king of Jericho was told, "Look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land." So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab: "Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, the men left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly, you may catch up with them." But she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given this land to you, and that great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and everyone's courage failed because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death." "Our lives for your lives," the men assured her. "If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land." So she let them down by a rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. Now she had said to them, "Go to the hills so that the pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way." The men said to her, "This oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless, when we enter the land, you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. And unless you have brought your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family into your house. If anyone goes outside your house into the street, his blood will be on his own head. We will not be responsible. As for anyone who is in the house with you, his blood will be on our head, if a hand is laid on him. But if you tell what we are doing, we will be released from the oath you made us swear." "Agreed," she replied. "Let it be as you say." So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied the scarlet cord in the window. When they left, they went into the hills and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them. Then the 2 men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us." Thank you, Lord, for your word.
As I say, good morning, everyone. One thing you can't say about the Bible is that it's boring. Take today's story, for example. It would make a great plot for a movie, full of flashbacks and set pieces. We've got a real action-adventure story and a bit of comedy rolled up with an unusual romance. It is a docudrama with a difference. We've got incompetent spies who are pretty much rumbled the moment they enter the city, a house of ill repute where they hide, and some equally gullible soldiers from Jericho going completely the wrong direction when they hunt for the spies outside the city. They don't even search for the spies in the house where they are hiding, under that pile of flax. And of course, there is that priceless moment when a prostitute lowers the two spies out of her window in the city wall, all the while having a whispered conversation, sending them off to safety, having extracted a promise to keep her and her family safe. But whilst there's this comedic action backdrop to this story, it is the romance element that is the most important. And it is romance of a different sort. This is the love story of a woman who falls in love with the God of another nation. She falls in love with the God of all creation. She is in awe of the one true God. She says, when we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. She acknowledges God at that moment as her Lord. He is God in heaven above and on earth below. And this must be our starting point for examining the Bible passage today. It's because of her declaration of faith in God that Rahab acts the way that she does. And it answers all our questions about why a Canaanite woman, Rahab, would risk her own life by hiding foreign spies in her home. It answers our questions about why she would extract a promise from them to spare her life. She knew that they were going to win the coming war. She knew that God had promised them that land. She knew the stories about the parting of the Red Sea, the escape from Egypt, and about the God who had protected his people. It answers our questions about why a prostitute would hang a red cord out of her window for several weeks, trusting in and waiting for the deliverance that had been promised to her. She did this because she believed in the one true God. She did this because she had courageous faith and because she did not allow her past to dictate her future. She did this because she trusted God. With that in mind, we're going to unpack the story and what it means for us today by looking at the themes of courageous faith, our past not imprisoning us, and God's faithfulness, but not necessarily in that order. So let's set our passage and its protagonist Rahab in context. The passage takes place at the very end of the Israelites' 40-year punishment of wandering in the desert, for that is what it was. This wandering came about as a result of the Israelites' lack of faith when they sent the first 10 spies into the land of milk and honey. And they reported back to Moses that there was no way that they could defeat the Canaanites. Now, 40 years later, Moses and the entire generation of those first spies, with the exception of the 2 faithful ones, Caleb and Joshua, have died out. The Israelites are back on the border of Canaan, and they have a new military and political leader, Joshua. Joshua, who consults God before he acts. They have arrived at the stunning oasis of Jericho, the city of palms, with its abundant water supply. They are on the brink of receiving the fulfillment of the promise God gave them for a land of their own. And that land is Canaan. And Canaan at that time comprised of a collection of city-states, and each one had its own king, or what we would think of as a mayor now. And they each controlled the area of land around it. And whilst they were independent city-states, they were independent of each other. At that time, they were under the overall control of Egypt. So Israel is back on the border, but now it has a reputation not just as an exiled, nomadic slave nation, but as a warrior nation
who has already defeated Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan. They have come back to the border with a reputation as a people who follow the God who dried up the Reed Sea or Red Sea for them to cross. No wonder the residents of Jericho were quaking in their boots. Or as Rahab put it, their hearts sank and they were melting. I love that image. They were melting in fear. And everyone's courage failed because of them and their God. Although they sort of didn't really accept God. So you kind of wonder why they were so afraid, bearing in mind it was a heavily fortified city with very high double walls that often had living spaces between them. In fact, this is a way that many Canaanite cities were built. And this is where Rahab comes in, because she lived in those walls. She must have lived quite high up because in the walls, because we know that they were often filled between those double walls with rubble and at the bottom, and then people would live higher up. And we also know this because she lowered those spies down out of her window to the outside of the city. So that's our context. But who was Rahab? The Bible dictionary tells us that in the New Testament, she is mentioned as the one who is justified by her works in James, and that the writer of Hebrews includes her among the ancient examples of faith in God. It goes on to say that she is almost certainly to be identified with Rahab, the wife of Salmon, the mother of Boaz, ancestor of David, who is included in the genealogy of Jesus. So I'm going to read you those verses. In the same way, was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? That's James 2, verse 25. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And that's Hebrews 11, 1-2 and 30-31. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Then there's a few generations, and then it says, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. And King David was in the genealogy of Jesus. So that's from Matthew 1, verse 1 and 5-6. This is a woman who is commended as a righteous person of faith. And yet she started life out as a harlot. That's what they said in the dictionary. Today we'd call her a sex worker or a prostitute. She's a woman of ill repute, a wrong 'un, and a Canaanite to boot. She's a foreigner. Although there is a long tradition reaching back at least to the Roman slave and Jewish historian Josephus of treating, they kind of washed her clean. They just treat her as an innkeeper. The text is very clear. Rahab is a prostitute. Economic factors often drive women into the sex trade. Today, this is still happening. Other causes include trafficking, debt, and addiction. We cannot be certain what led Rahab to become a sex worker. In his commentary, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth for Everyone, John Goldingay suggests that perhaps Rahab was a widow. Widows without sons or relatives often have very little option to generate income in the ancient Near East. And yet, evidently, according to the text, she has a family to be concerned for. But perhaps they have a hard time making ends meet, and this is why she learned to survive without being dependent on them or a burden on them. In her book, Lineage of Grace, which is a novelization of the 5 women known to us in the genealogy of Christ, Francine Rivers suggests that Rahab may have been absorbed briefly as a young girl into the king's harem, and her family would have benefited from that, but that once ruined and cast off, she would have no alternative but to be a prostitute. On the other hand, she may have been sold into prostitution by her family. This is all speculation, and you may wonder why I'm spending so much time in it. No one can tell us exactly why Rahab was in the position she was in. But her position was one where she would have been living on the margins of society, used and despised in equal measure. And this is why I'm concentrated on it. She was a sinful woman. And it might be quite easy to condemn her. And yet, Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners. They followed him. They were part of his church, and he changed their lives. And how things changed for Rahab. Joshua 6 records that Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and her mother, her brothers and her sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies into Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. This history was written very shortly after Rahab had rescued those spies. She lived among them, not as an outsider, not outside the camp, but among them. Things changed for her. And she had a future she could probably never have imagined. Her past did not limit her future. And this is a very important thing to understand here. Not letting her past dictate, limit, or imprison her future or her actions. Some of you know I occasionally lead services and preach at a prison. And the women there have literally been imprisoned by their pasts. Unfortunately, many people today, whilst not in a literal prison, are still imprisoned by their pasts in different ways, including by their circumstances and their past experiences. Is that something you are wrestling with? Perhaps today is the day where you say, "Thus far and no more," where you can ask God for help. And so I'm going to pause for a minute, and I'd like to give you the opportunity, give us all the opportunity to quietly respond to what we've heard so far this morning. In a moment of stillness, I'm going to invite you to offer God your lives afresh, to ask him to help us lay aside our pasts, and to ask him to remind us that we are new creations in Christ.